Hello and most welcome to 956 in the Heidegger series. We have a very clement afternoon here. I wouldn't say it's really warm. That would be an exaggeration. But at least there is sun, and I found this discarded hall here that is somewhat wind protected, so it will not develop into disturbances. I will continue to talk about mindfulness. I think it's rather interesting, and the more I think about fractality, the more amazing it gets, this thing with mindfulness that has grown exponentially the last decade and a half, and it become one of the most invested things ever to happen within therapeutical systems in the West. This is even more prevalent in the United States. I don't know how many $1 billion are spent on this, and books. Just go into Barnes and Nobles or Amazon.com or something similar, and you will see thousands of books on mindfulness. But there is something in that really gnaws at me, and it's been doing that for the whole time. It's absolutely ridiculous to a point. And the reason being, yes, mindfulness do work. It does work. I think it originated in Burma. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm quite sure it was Burma. And this whole idea that this indigenous part doesn't play any role in the whole thing. It's just a piece of plastic that sort of can be molded in whatever way you want, and you can write a book, or you can have a course, you can have lectures, you can be a world-renowned speaker like Kabat-Zinn. And you can say, this works in Burma, it should work here too. And I would say that is Quatsch, as they say in German. Absolute Quatsch. This completely ignoring all what the complexities of the psyche is. Complexities of the psyche does not mean that everyone is the same. And it definitely means that everything what we have in our background, I would call that Geschichte, so it doesn't get confused with history. The Geschichte of ours is not the same as the Burmese people. We might share history, that is true, but we cannot share Geschichte, because that's the actual passage. My passage is unique, and so is my fellow beings in the same place, which makes for some similarity, which is not the proper word to use when it comes to fractality. It is rather level of complexity. Level of complexity tells what is different. It is the actual level of complexity that is the Geschichte. How could that be the same in Burma? This is a simplification of the psyche, the mental, the spiritual, to a level when it gets completely absurd. And oddly enough, these peoples are not so very different from people like John Searle. Brain in the what people, we could call them. They don't see the indigenous as a thing at all. They just use the idea of non-duality in a very sloppy way. Non-duality is something romantic, emotionally laced, something like that. It's nice with incense and so forth and so forth. Absolute rot. There is nothing that is similar between us and the people of Burma when it comes to the inner fractality. And that is because the Geschichte creates that. Individual moments, not to be seen in a linear perspective, but in a fractal perspective. But I will give example also from classical physics, the normal history view. And their traditions are completely different, and they are not superficial. Why we do different things is not just when you see people as objects, putting up a Christmas tree. It has a long story that goes inwards, and we try to understand that from the outwards, from the perspective of the demon of Pascal. Laplace, sorry, the demon of Laplace. I knew that something was wrong there. So we can understand. We created this very coarse and bystander perspective of what is it to live as a Burmese person. We see them from the outside, and we are not aware that we have an insight that constructs the reality, and therefore we use a uniquely Swedish way, or a way that is just typical for the small village of, let's see, Vårgårda, where you've been living your whole life, and you're transplanted to Burma, and you see it from the outside, unbeknownst to what is your inner doing, which you can never reach, unbeknownst to their outer inner area, and outer for that matter, and you use a technological model. You can measure how tall is the Burmese Christmas tree, and you say, apart from this, they just have this, and you name that. You call these extra things that you don't have in Vårgårda, you call that culture, whereas you don't have a culture, you think. Anyway, it's outside of yourself. It's not part of yourself. You just interact in culture like it was a game of some sort. That didn't mean anything as well. I think game was a really lousy metaphor, sorry about that, because games mean something. But this would be a game that doesn't mean anything. You're just passively participating in raising the Christmas tree. You passively put the thing around it, and you understand this process by distance, by forehand. Just as we mentioned maybe half a year about people reading Bible texts, and they read them from a distance of 1,000 miles, and they don't get engaged in the text. Like it was the case that, for instance, the Bible was written for somebody to read it off completely forehand and without putting their own life in the position of what happens in the Bible. It's a little bit like Jesus was not preaching to the people. He preached to the people that were not real somehow. And you're supposed to look at that from perspective of laboratory assistant somehow. And in this case, both Jesus and his listeners becomes objects, shallow objects, soulless objects. And then you use the cause and effect from classical physics, and then you can make the conclusion. All what Jesus said was simply metaphors. It was actually told to me when I was young, going to confirmation camp, for instance. Those are all metaphors. Well, how can they become metaphors? This is not a defense of Christianity, just give an example how absurd it gets. How can they become metaphors? But in order for something to become metaphorical, you have something to compare it with. Take Lakoff and Johnson. In order for their metaphors of height being like quantity, the higher up you go when you staple coins, the more quantity you get, you use the body. So the metaphor is coming from one place, going somewhere. In this place, I think people are mostly pretending the metaphor is not going anywhere. It has to go somewhere to be meaningful. And where does it go? Well, it goes into classical physics. And that you don't tell people because that is reality. And this is something I partly can understand now. I won't criticize that part because it is reality. In a way, it is reality. Uh, but as long as we have only one reality, it becomes really problematic in this case, for instance, with mindfulness. It becomes absurd. Then we are just plastic dolls, and inside is something that does not exist. So the only reason people in the day of the past, and I actually had these discussions many times, the only reason people in the past thought they had souls was because of religion. I would say it has nothing to do with religion. Religion is something else. Religion doesn't say that you have a soul. It says maybe that the soul is eternal, but that's a whole other thing. Soul means the complexity. That is why they use that word. And they did not do this funny four-handed thing in the Renaissance, and they definitely not even do it in antiquity. It would just have been completely ludicrous to say that the soul is something extra you add to the personality. Why on earth would the word have come up if it doesn't have a meaning? And this new nonsensical meaning, I would say that is sort of renaming process. So when we say soul today, it's actually the same word pronounced the same way, but because of difference, all of a sudden it has sort of acquired a sort of new meaning. You use it when you talk about things in the past. You hear it becomes complicated here, but my point still is the Burmese wouldn't buy that. They wouldn't buy into that. For them, they have a whole language. If it's anything similar to the Indic language, which I can assume they are because they're so highly influenced from each other, they have a vocabulary on at least 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 words. This is just a low estimate. Words we don't have, and they are just pointing to the cornucopia of the complexities of the inner side. Why would those words be there in Sanskrit, in Pali, in Malayalam, in Tamil? Why would they be there if they didn't serve any purpose? Would it be like a hysterical, mythological, rabid action? We sit here and we just invent words, and we have no idea why. That defies the idea of language games, that defies everything we know about the workings of the world today. It is the old representationalistic idea, and that is outdated. Could not people just try to forget representationalism? Because it's so primitive somehow. I wouldn't say it's wrong. It wish it was wrong, but it's just primitive. It makes up an idea that everything is so incredibly simple, so you can write the whole history of mankind on the backside of a matchbox. I think that is what it's implying. I would never ever point to representationalism and say it's wrong. Not anymore anyway, because it's just simplistic. It doesn't deserve the truth value wrong. Boring, as Paul Feyerabend said about evolution. It's just plain boring. Complexity tells its own truth. It doesn't need to be true in the way of representationalism. And a true document, manuscript, is true by itself, just like a painting is true by itself. And just because we can't see paintings, listen to music today, doesn't mean that we have the authority to disqualify experience and say experience is not legit anymore. We need epistemology that points to some world, other world, and some experts can tell us about that reality. Or as in Sweden, we have an utskott for everything. Hello, what all this utskott to do with political decisions? Well, that's to figure out how things are. And isn't it obvious in its whole circus we have in Sweden with the parliament that the decisions, depending on how they are formulated in the utskott, the chambers that are also called, when people try to figure out how things really are, and they jump out of themselves and they can look at things objectively or something like that. It's just beyond words. It's just beyond words. Of course, everything is already decided in the utskott. It's the formulation and how you see on things will determine the decision. You can't vote against intelligence. That's just how it is. But you can try, but you won't succeed. You won't gather votes for that. Maybe just the odd one who doesn't think. So the utskott is where the decisions are made. And the parliament itself has become just a theatre. It has become a neologism, a renaming of democracy. And the renaming is actually true what renaming sort of does. We say the decisions are taken within the parliament. This newly created parliament that doesn't have two chambers even. Decisions are made there. It's a renaming. It actually means no decisions are made there. It's like double talk in 1984, but not really, because double talk doesn't work. We are somewhere aware that no decisions are taken within the parliament. It is not something we can be unaware of. We already know our lack of influence. This is the story from fractality. It is in our postures, it is in our voices, it is in how we do things, because things are not that disjunct. So you in the nation can be absolutely disjunct from the political system. You know you don't have a role to play, and you can act out a theatrical play that you get angry if you don't have anything to affect. But that will in itself be a new language game and will not influence the original language game. And this is not me being cynical. I think the other thing is cynical. Because in the end you get frustrated somehow to some extent. Why don't you have a say? Well, you can only have a say if you actually do things. That is an absolute prerequisite. If you don't do things, you don't have a say. It's like working in a bakery. If you don't make any loaves or bake any breads or set any doughs, you won't get any bread. That's how it is. I think that's obvious. I don't participate in politics. Yes, but don't do it. You don't have to. But of course you have to understand you don't have any role to play in politics then. I actually did hear that when I was very little. We were playing football on the field outside my house, and it was some of the kids that complained. I didn't want that to happen. I think when we lost. And I was thinking to myself, he wasn't participating, he was sitting. This is the same with politics. You know when you don't act. There is a reason for you don't act, because in the same moment you don't act, all your thoughts, all your words, all your body will calm down in level of complexity. It will happen simultaneously. So you already know you don't have any part to play. And partly you choose that yourself, because it's something you can influence. The sheer idea of outwardness and this idea that the world is out there and we can only affect it by proxy, it is ludicrous. And this is not me trying to be more colloquial and wanting to have politicians walking around. They do walk around, but it's not because they kept the traditions in France, Italy, or even more obvious in Latin American countries. It had nothing to do with that. It is not old-fashioned. We are still interconnected. The idea that we're not connected, that's the idea. But there is no idea that we are connected. That is a fact of fractality. Otherwise, it wouldn't be any understanding, wouldn't be any language. I don't have to go through all these arguments. We already know that. It's been 900 lectures. We know about the interconnectedness. We are already in on it. And we have a tendency not to understand that. And I think we do still, because the system you can't lie to. Rather horrid thought, on the contrary, to think lies could be possible and you can lie about the whole reality like in 1984. I would say you cannot. I think there George Orwell was absolutely wrong. I absolutely love the novel, but I would say the whole idea is completely wrong. It does not work that way. You cannot reinvent words and they can have a completely different meaning without the context, without people using them, and a government can't decide for a new meaning of words. This is representationalism. And of course, why would George Orwell be outside of representationalism? Of course, he's a victim for that as well. No, words come from use, and it's the whole population. So when the government say we're going to use this double talk, we're going to call war peace and peace war and so forth, that will not change the meaning of the word a tiny whiny bit. It will, however, create a new language game, a renaming. I mentioned that before from Derrida, but you can also say it from a Wittgensteinian perspective. And you can say there is a new language game going on. And you can see who are the actors, so to speak, in this language game. It's the government, and they decided that these new words should be used. So this is not the same context of usage where the term peace gets its context from. It gets its context from reality itself, by doing things that are peaceful. And the renaming is a completely different language game. It has maybe 3 participants, government, the one who tells it, and the sort of subject. And it's a passivity involved here. I would say peace is something active that you actually do, whereas this word is much more laid back, so to speak. You don't have to be involved to say the word. So you just say it and it doesn't mean anything. People say, oh, the word peace has lost its meaning. No, it's a different language game. Peace can't lose its meaning that all of a sudden. And words actually can't lose their value by not being used. They can be forgotten, but for the actual language game to be gone because it plays a part in the context of the whole language, there still would be sort of a slot for it. This is a crude metaphor, sorry about that. But still would be a slot for words that has disappeared. Because all the words are participating, they are nested. This nesting system, it makes it impossible just to remove words. But you can have the misunderstanding to a certain point. Once you don't have access to yourself, you will have misunderstanding of how language works, and therefore you will also be misunderstood by others. That happens simultaneously. This is once more the argument from private language. If you try to acquire private language, the only thing that will happen instead of you developing a private language is that you will misunderstand yourself and you will misunderstand others. And the third thing will be what you say will not be understandable to others. So in this case, language is not so different from, for instance, making wine. If you make a lousy wine that smells like vinegar, it will not go into consummation. People won't drink it. And it doesn't matter if you call it wine. If it's not drank, it is not wine to a certain extent. Think in that way. Think there is a interactive reality, and Susie Frobel is just tip of the iceberg. Wittgenstein is underneath. We have Heidegger, we have Husserl, we have of course Derrida, Rodolphe Gasquet, and all these others. It's just the top of the iceberg. Understand that knowledge is something you do. What you keep in your consciousness at the moment, it is just a small part. This is why all the 900 lectures, bar none, are completely necessary to get to this level. The same if you learn how to play chess. You can't just turn up at the last lesson in the chess school at last of the year and say, well, I just take the last class and I can skip all the others so I can watch telly those Wednesday nights. No, you cannot. Just because it's not in your consciousness doesn't mean it's gone. I would say that's the lure of the ego. To think for some reason that only the knowledge you presently have in your head and you can talk about is all the knowledge you have. You see here, this is how we treated Burmese here. Actually, it's not a little colonialism from the side of Kabat-Zinn, the inventor of mindfulness. He has the audacity to say that Burmese people doesn't have an inside, and all that he sees is what is Burmese person. And I would say that is pretty prejudiced, because that would make them look really bad in some situation because we don't understand their inner side, what that means in that context and so forth. I can give an example directly. If you point to something in a book and you happen to point your finger wrong, in Asia it's very common that they actually slap your finger like this. It can almost be painful. It feels so abrupt and so almost abusive, but it doesn't mean anything. They just want to help you quickly before you lose your idea in your head. They want to take your finger away from the point it was pointing to, because they know that your whole body tries to understand something and it needs to be terminated as quick as possible. But the first time I felt it was like being slapped over the face. So odd. People that rarely touches you even, all of a sudden, but is trying to help you, because they know how, especially for me as a Westerner, how short-term my attention span is. It needs to be connected. We don't know that. We don't know what attention span is. So we get used to have a low awareness all the time. And when you say you don't know your inner attention span, that it varies over the day, you are 100% guaranteed to be at your very lowest all the time. It will not be any higher than the lowest. It could still be good compared to others, but from your level it would be lousy. On your own level of awareness it would be lousy. You cannot in this instant compare to others, because you are in yourself an individual, and you are in on the thing that is called constructing the world. And if you're not aware, you're not here, you're not participating. And even if others think you're participating, that would be the Burmese take once more. They think you're in on it. Only you can decide that, and no one else on this earth. Move a bit here to catch the last rays of the sun. Let's continue a bit with Susie Frobel. We're going to nesting versus global local perspectives. I just started before. Let me repeat. The neuropsychologist David Eagleman asked people to jump off a 50-meter tower into a net. He was trying to find out whether perceived slowing of time was due to the high-speed neural snapshots, something we already discussed in chapter 1. The idea was to see if the slowing down of time in stressful situations such as an adrenaline spilling freefall results from higher temporal resolution. However, the jumpers who were instructed to stare at flashing numbers on display strapped to the wrists did not perceive the numbers at an increased temporal resolution during their jump. Eagleman concluded that we can rule out a higher temporal resolution as the case of time slowing down. He suggests that subjective duration is linked to the amount of detail we process. That is to say, if time in retrospect appears to have slowed down during a stressful situation, this is so because more memories are laid down during such a situation. And I think this is vitally important. We normally think that we can access a certain amount at every instant of time. This is not true when it comes to fractality. The deeper you go down in delta depth and delta width, the more access you can have to more thoughts at the very same time. And the lower you are in depth and the narrower you are in width, the less thinking you can access in one singular moment. And this is most interesting because it has become a habit to start with people and say that they can usually not perform simultaneous actions. But we don't look at other people's, other cultures. Is that true for the Chinese, for the Japanese? I don't think so. Because this shows that the fractality is the important thing. The working of the brain creates more time. We can't use the idea of this old-fashioned clock time to sort of measure thinking in one culture towards another one. We have to remember that we got stuck in a mode of reasoning about these things that turn out to be completely wrong. That also meant that we haven't paid much attention to these things, we haven't studied them, and therefore obviously we don't have any knowledge of them. We can't say we should have a fair amount of knowledge because they have, and then appeal to some sort of democracy of the panopticon or Laplace demon and beg him to say we should have that knowledge too because they have, and we think knowledge is inborn like Socrates. It's not just about taking this positive message to heart, it is actually doing it. And then you will notice you can expand your thinking well beyond what was previously possible in classical physics, in representationalism, because that is their reality, or my reality, I would say too. But it's not a necessary reality, therefore not wrong. You claim those things as John Searle do, you live in that reality too. Otherwise he wouldn't claim it. It's a little bit the language game again. You cannot trick the language game. If he says what he says, we have good reason to actually believe what he says. Otherwise he wouldn't say it. Try to rename that he doesn't mean these things doesn't make much sense. So debates can in this case be dangerous And therefore I hugely admire the take on Searle that Jacques Derrida did, never criticizing Searle, just says that the world of Searle from could be opener, could be less limited, but he doesn't say the opinions of Searle. He doesn't say that his philosophy is limited. He says that his world is limited. And that is quite a different thing. That is not something he can influence. Well, anyway, not that easy. Therefore, philosophical debates usually ends with some sort of renaming process at best. You come to you decide to put your arms down for a moment and have a peace that lasts for a while. And then you conclude we need to rename this thing for the public debate. But we are still going to mean different things with our words. Renaming is what it is. Renaming is a specific process. Normal words were never renamed. They were used. They have a Geschichte. And that's very, very different from having a history. Geschichte cannot be replaced. You cannot replace the whole winemaking tradition of France with an artificial wine. Why? Well, it is because matter, biology, everything is intertwined with tradition. You cannot separate one part from another. And this is what I mentioned with Stephen Wolfram's insight into that even simple algorithms will do their trick. They will not be predictable, and therefore history doesn't repeat itself in either from hindsight in a deterministic way and a way that you can actually somehow analyze and expose to 100%. You can't go back in time that way, even if you know what happened. Can't go back. Not like that. And this is also the point from fractality. Protension and retention is radically different in this aspect from planning or doing future in the more regular sense. It's a unique thing. And it's not based. Good projection is never based on the past in that way that planning is. And it's a quality difference. Planning doesn't succeed. We know that. Because it has the mark of what it is not. It's not retention. Gets its sustenance from retention in the bodily, fractal, chaotic, balanced system. We need retention to keep our balance, to keep knowledge afloat. But it's not snapshots we put together of the past that makes up future. That future won't happen because we put randomness into the equation. Will not work, will not be having predictable value, will not tell the future, will not tell your destiny. Whereas if you do retention, you train yourself for retention, like you train everything else. We're not even at the same level in walking as we were 10 years earlier. We get better with everything. If you train yourself on a daily basis in retention, you will be better at receiving more difference and therefore more resilience, and you will become stronger, you will be more fractal, and then you will be able to do pretension better. But never ever is there snapshots, or there is not you comparing different sequences. If I go left, it will be blah da da da, as I did before. If I go right, it will be da 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 da, in a linear causal net. doesn't work that way. And if you try to make it work that way, you will miss the point. Your arrow will not hit its goal. It will miss. So fractality is the way into successful futuring, successful pasting, whatever you call it. Because success is what you get when you go down to what you really have in reality. That's the main reason. Even though I started out learning about fractality because it was so interesting, I don't think that's an unnecessary point. I think that's a quite an important thing, because this sort of entices my interest, and this is very far from boring. But it's also that this has a promising method, a method that will work. Otherwise, why would be the idea to spend time with this if it doesn't make your life better? So I go against the idea that philosophy is a nice pastime that's so somehow enriching your intellectual power. It should be actually useful in this life, and thereby it can actually be useful as spiritual thing, but also going to the shop and buying vegetables. Fractality doesn't make difference. It's a matter of leveling. And the simple idea of having only one level is a perceived idea, but we know it doesn't have to be that way. Your world doesn't have to be that way. But remember, it is your world that's different. A less fractal world is still a world. It's perceived to be that way, and you start your hypothesis or whatever you do from that world. But fractality shows that there are higher worlds, and that is very different from higher ideology or higher philosophy. It is the world that changes. The world doesn't change. In the end, nothing changes. It's just a renaming process that we do in academia, philosophy, and we did in science until the event of quantum mechanics. It's a renaming process. Famous example of renaming in scientific context is the taking away of the ether. That was not so much as a gigantic discovery as a different way of making calculations. And to say that ether disappeared is a bit of an exaggeration, because it didn't serve much purpose before. It had a purpose, so to speak, in a language game. The language game did not really essentially change, but we stopped using ether in that way, but the slot is still there, so to speak. I hope this metaphor works. It works for me because we mentioned ether before. I remember somewhere in the 200s we mentioned ether, and it's a good example of how something disappears all of a sudden, but the slot is still there. And do remember that ether didn't have that many properties, so not much disappeared. It was just the conveyor of waves before. And these waves could then still be conveyed, but not by anything. So that actual waves remain, and that was the important thing. And then you understand that it is the purpose that is more important. Because it's what something is doing in the language game that makes it meaningful, gives it action, gives it direction. And I would say that direction doesn't disappear by the word ether became obsolete. The very pronunciation of ether or the very word will not be in any scientific journals, but the slot is still there. You can do maybe the last example. I will stop the metaphor. I think I overused it. You can still have a completely fit and working physics still with ether. You can build this structure here, and you can do telecommunication It's until you reach that point and you see here it doesn't work when we use ether. That is in our normal everyday sphere, doesn't really make much change. So sometimes science is being on a certain level overly strict, and I would say that would even be wrong to a rather great extent to tell this has happened in the past, or I need to change my tense. It would have been wrong to tell students in the late 19th century don't use ether. That would be above them, or that would never suffer anything from continuing to use ether. So we have this overcorrectedness with scientific terms. We forget that they do belong to a certain level. And of course it wouldn't be good to use ether if you work at NASA or something like that. Maybe there it would cause some troubles. So going down to the school and say to the students, ether do not longer exists, that could actually send the students into the wrong direction. Still exist in their level, therefore why stop talking about it? Or even that teacher's very saying of it will put their attention to their awareness. It would be like pointing to something, and thereby sending the students slightly into the wrong direction. Many such small wrong directions will add up to sort of shove the nice nesting of the fractality, which is a reality, out of balance, make it less complex. Something will end up in the wrong level. Something will end up in the wrong level. And levels are incredibly important in fractality. And I think I need a drink of some sort, soft drink. I say thank you very much. It was enormously interesting. It was actually rather a nice place, this. I liked it. Of course it's not good when it's raining, but today it provided shelter for the lecture with its walls, and it still gave sunlight. So it has its use, and it's not fair to say that it's useless, as we say about ether.